Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to revive him. He failed. A hospital tried to revive him. It failed.
For more than 3 decades, one man carried a secret and never said a word. He stood closer to Elvis Presley in death than almost anyone else on earth ever stood to him in life. He touched what the cameras never saw. He noticed what the official reports never printed. And for 33 years, he said nothing at all. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he broke his silence. And the few words he chose to say reopened a wound that fans thought had finally healed. What did he see in that room on August 16, 1977? Why did he wait so long to speak? And why, even now, does his brief statement still send a chill through anyone who hears it? Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why so many people believe the full story of Elvis Presley's death has never actually been told. Memphis in mid-August is heavy with heat, the kind that presses down on the whole city and makes even the mornings feel slow. On August 16, 1977, nothing about the atmosphere at Graceland suggested that history was about to change. Elvis Presley, 42 years old and preparing for a fresh run of concert dates, was expected to board a plane that evening bound for Portland, Maine, the first stop of a new tour. His band had rehearsed. His wardrobe was packed. His name was already printed on tickets that thousands of fans were holding in anticipation. The night before had unfolded the way so many nights at Graceland did in those final years, a strange blend of ordinary domestic routine and larger-than-life celebrity. Elvis had visited his dentist earlier in the evening for a minor procedure. Afterward, he returned home and spent time with the people closest to him, including his cousin Billy Smith and his fiancée at the time, Ginger Alden. Accounts from people who were present describe a relaxed evening, a game of racquetball on the private court, a stretch of time at the piano where Elvis sang gospel hymns, the kind of music that had shaped him since childhood in Tupelo. Those around him remembered him as talkative, even upbeat, discussing the upcoming shows with what sounded like genuine enthusiasm. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Elvis went upstairs. He told Ginger he wanted to read for a while before sleeping, a habit that was nothing unusual for him. He carried a book into his private bathroom, a large second-floor space that had effectively become his personal retreat inside the mansion. Hours slipped by. There was nothing strange about that either. Those close to him knew he sometimes stayed in there for long stretches. But as the early afternoon approached and there was still no sign of him, a quiet unease began to settle over the house. It was Ginger Alden who finally went to check. When she opened the bathroom door, she found him collapsed on the floor, unresponsive. What she described afterward, the position of his body, the stillness of the room, became one of the most retold, re-examined moments in modern celebrity history. She screamed for help, and within moments, the household staff and family members who were present rushed toward the room, refusing at first to accept what they were seeing. An emergency call went out from Graceland almost immediately, and paramedics arrived within minutes. What they found when they reached the bathroom has been described in various accounts over the years, though never through any single official exhaustive public record. Because, as we'll get to later, the most detailed medical documentation from that day would be sealed from public view for decades. What has been widely reported, through interviews with people connected to the case over the years, is that the emergency crew who responded did not immediately register that the man on the floor in front of them was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Years of declining health, weight gain, and the physical effects of his lifestyle had altered his appearance dramatically from the lean, dynamic performer fans pictured when they thought of Elvis Presley. Attempts at resuscitation began at the house and continued during the frantic drive to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. But by the time he arrived, there was little more that could be done. He was pronounced dead at 3:30 in the afternoon. The news moved faster than anyone could control. Local radio stations in Memphis broke the story first, and within the hour it had reached every major network in the country. Regular programming was interrupted across America. Newspapers scrambled to redesign front pages that had already gone to print for the evening editions. Outside the gates of Graceland, a crowd began to form almost immediately, small at first, then swelling into the thousands within hours, a wordless vigil that would stretch on for days. Behind the gates, away from the cameras and the crowds, a very different process was just beginning. Before the public would ever be allowed to say goodbye, Elvis's body had to go through a series of procedures that very few people ever witnessed firsthand. And the man who oversaw much of that process would go on to keep his experience almost entirely private for more than 3 decades. The funeral home entrusted with preparing Elvis Presley's body for public viewing had handled the arrangements for prominent Memphis families before, but nothing in its history compared to what was about to happen. Before the body could even reach the embalming table, a legally required autopsy had already been performed at the hospital, a process that would later become the center of enormous public debate. Once that was complete, the body was released to the funeral director's team, and the real work of preparing Elvis for public view began. The lead embalmer on the case had decades of experience in the industry by 1977. He had handled car accident victims, elderly patients, tragic and sudden deaths of every kind. Work that hardens a person to the sight of death in ways most people never have to confront. And yet, according to people who later spoke about the case, even he found himself unsettled by what he was looking at. Years of health struggles had left their mark. Reports that surfaced afterward, largely through second-hand accounts and later interviews rather than any single official document, described significant swelling throughout the body, a common effect in sudden cardiac deaths, along with discoloration consistent with the medical circumstances surrounding his passing. His hair, dyed jet black for the entirety of his public career, had grown out enough in recent months to reveal streaks of natural gray at the roots, a detail almost no fan ever knew, because the image of Elvis with dark, glossy hair had become so fixed in the public imagination that the reality of an aging, graying man underneath it all felt almost unthinkable. The embalmer's job was not simply preservation. It was restoration, an attempt to give millions of grieving fans a version of Elvis that matched the memory they were carrying, rather than the toll that illness and time had actually taken. That meant hours of careful, painstaking cosmetic work, color correction to counter the discoloration, techniques to reduce the appearance of swelling, and the redyeing and restyling of his hair to match the image the world expected to see one final time. It was, by every account that has surfaced since, one of the most demanding and emotionally weighted jobs of his career. When the work was finally finished, something happened that set this case apart from every other the embalmer had worked on before. Instead of disposing of the tools and materials used during the procedure, as was standard practice, he chose to keep them. Quietly, and without telling almost anyone, he gathered items connected to the case, including gloves used during the procedure, a pair of forceps, tools used in the cosmetic restoration process, some of the original paperwork connected to the case, and a replacement identification tag. That last item carried its own strange story. The original hospital tag attached to the body had reportedly gone missing before the funeral home received it, allegedly taken by someone who managed to get close enough to remove it as a keepsake. A new tag, marked simply John Doe, had to be created and attached in its place. The embalmer placed everything into a single box. And then for the next 33 years, he said absolutely nothing about it. It's worth pausing here to consider just how unusual that silence really was. This was not a minor figure in the story of Elvis Presley's death. This was the person who spent hours alone with the body, who saw details that no autopsy photograph or press release ever captured, who handled physical evidence connected to one of the most scrutinized deaths of the 20th century, and who, for more than 3 decades, chose to say nothing publicly at all. He did not write a memoir. He did not sit for a tell-all interview. He did not sell his story to a tabloid in the immediate aftermath, even as the value of any inside account of Elvis's final hours would have been enormous. While journalists, conspiracy theorists, and biographers spent years chasing every possible lead about Elvis's death, the sealed autopsy, the 14 medications found in his system, the physician who had prescribed him thousands of pills in his final months, the one person who had arguably seen more of the physical reality of that day than almost anyone else, simply stayed quiet. That silence became its own kind of mystery. Why would someone with first-hand knowledge, someone who had literally held pieces of the story in his hands, choose to disappear from the narrative entirely? Some who knew him later suggested it was simple professional discretion, the same code of confidentiality that governs the funeral industry more broadly, where discussing the private, physical details of a client's death is considered a serious ethical breach regardless of who that client happens to be. Others believed there was something more specific he was protecting, some detail he felt was either too painful, too sensitive, or too explosive to share. Whatever the reason, the silence held for 33 years. And then, in 2010, it broke. Rather than sitting down for a television interview or publishing a written account, the embalmer's break from silence took an unusual, and to many, an uncomfortable form. He attempted to sell the collection of items he had kept from that night through a Chicago auction house. The listing reportedly included the gloves, the forceps, tools connected to the cosmetic restoration, paperwork tied to the case, and the replacement identification tag, physical relics of one of the most private and painful nights in the history of American popular culture, suddenly being offered up for sale to collectors. The auction sparked immediate controversy. Before any sale could be finalized, the funeral home that had originally handled the arrangements stepped in, arguing that the items in question belonged to them rather than to any individual employee, regardless of how long ago the work had been done. The dispute halted the auction, and the collection was ultimately returned rather than sold to a private buyer. It was during this brief resurfacing into public attention that the embalmer made the only substantial public statement he would ever offer about that night. He did not go into detail. He did not describe specific physical findings or make any claim about the cause of death. What he reportedly said, in essence, was that people deserved to know the truth about what happened in that room. That was it. No elaboration. No follow-up interview laying out exactly what the truth referred to. And then, just as quickly as he had reappeared, he stepped back out of the public conversation and never revisited the subject again. The vagueness of that single statement is precisely what has kept it alive in public conversation for over a decade since. Was he referring to the physical condition of the body? Details more severe or more revealing than anything that had ever been officially confirmed? Was he speaking more broadly about the culture of secrecy that had surrounded Elvis's death from the very beginning? From the sealed autopsy records to the carefully managed public image the Presley estate maintained for years afterward? Or was it something simpler and more human? The emotional weight of having spent that night alone with a man the whole world thought it knew, only to discover up close just how much of the real story had been hidden from public view long before his death. No one has ever gotten a clear answer, and the embalmer himself has never offered one. To understand why that single brief statement carried so much weight, it helps to understand just how much of the official record from that day has never actually been made public. Immediately after Elvis's death, medical examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco announced to reporters that the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia connected to underlying heart disease, and stated publicly that there was no evidence pills had played a role. For a grieving public desperate for a straightforward explanation, that statement became the accepted account almost overnight. But in the weeks that followed, as laboratory results from the toxicology testing came back, a far more complicated picture began to emerge. According to reports on those findings, more than a dozen different prescription medications were detected in Elvis's system, including drugs prescribed for pain, anxiety, and sleep. One substance in particular, codeine, was reportedly found at a level well beyond what would typically be expected from standard medical use. These findings did not necessarily contradict the official cause of death, but they complicated the simple narrative that had already been delivered to the public, and they placed intense scrutiny on the man responsible for so many of those prescriptions. Elvis's longtime personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolos, widely known to those close to Elvis simply as Dr. Nick. Records that emerged during the years of investigation that followed indicated that Dr. Nick had written an extraordinary volume of prescriptions for Elvis in the final months of his life, covering everything from painkillers to sedatives to stimulants. He was eventually brought up on criminal charges related to overprescription, though a jury ultimately acquitted him. Years later, a separate review by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners reached a very different conclusion, permanently revoking his license to practice medicine after determining that he had engaged in what the board described as gross malpractice involving multiple patients, Elvis among them. And yet, through all of this, one crucial piece of the puzzle has remained locked away. Shortly after Elvis's death, his father Vernon Presley made the decision to have the full autopsy report and associated toxicology records sealed, keeping them out of public view for 50 years. In 1982, the Tennessee Supreme Court upheld that decision, ensuring the complete, unredacted findings would remain private well into the 21st century. That decision, whatever the intention behind it, guaranteed that the full picture of what happened to Elvis Presley's body that night would remain incomplete in the public record for an entire lifetime. Researchers, journalists, and biographers have had to work instead from partial statements, second-hand accounts, and fragments of testimony, including, notably, the very fragment the embalmer offered in 2010. Without access to the sealed records, that fragment took on an outsized significance, becoming one of the very few first-hand claims from anyone who had actually seen the body up close, made by someone with no obvious financial or personal motive to exaggerate. While the questions about the medical details of Elvis's death played out over decades, the public farewell itself unfolded within days. Vernon Presley made the decision to hold an open casket viewing at Graceland, believing that the millions of fans whose lives had been touched by his son's music deserved a final chance to say goodbye in person. A large copper casket was placed beneath the crystal chandelier in the entrance hall of the mansion. Elvis was dressed in a white suit with a pale blue shirt, and on his hand rested the TCB ring he had worn for years, the initials standing for the phrase that had become something of a personal motto: taking care of business. More than 30,000 people are estimated to have passed through Graceland during the viewing, some having driven through the night from other states just to spend a few seconds beside the casket. The August heat was brutal, but almost no one left the line. Photography was explicitly forbidden out of respect for the family's wishes, though that boundary would not hold entirely. A tabloid photographer would later succeed in secretly capturing an image of Elvis in his casket, a photograph that went on to become one of the best-selling tabloid covers in American publishing history, much to the devastation of the Presley family. Amid the crowds and the security and the media chaos surrounding the viewing, one of the most quietly devastating moments belonged to a 9-year-old girl. Lisa Marie Presley approached her father's casket holding a small bracelet and asked if she could place it with him. She was allowed to, and the small piece of jewelry was gently set on his wrist before the casket was closed for the final time, a private gesture of love from a child who would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of being Elvis Presley's daughter. The following day, the funeral procession moved through the streets of Memphis, drawing tens of thousands of mourners who lined the roads in near silence. It remains one of the largest public processions the city has ever seen. Elvis was first laid to rest at Forest Hill Cemetery beside his mother Gladys, in what the family believed would be his permanent resting place. That belief did not last long. Within days of the burial, reports began circulating of an alleged plot to break into the crypt and steal Elvis's remains, reportedly in an attempt to hold the body for ransom. Police arrested several men connected to the scheme near the cemetery grounds, and though questions have lingered for years about how serious or credible that plot actually was, with some later theories suggesting the entire episode may have been engineered specifically to justify moving the body, the Presley family was not willing to take any chances. Vernon Presley made the decision to move both his son and his former wife from Forest Hill Cemetery to the private grounds of Graceland itself, where security could be far more tightly controlled. The remains were transferred quietly, away from the public eye, and reburied within the meditation garden on the estate, a small, tranquil section of the property that has since become the permanent resting place of much of the Presley family. There is a detail here that has never received quite as much attention as it deserves. According to Nancy Rooks, a longtime housekeeper at Graceland who later wrote about her years working for the family, Elvis had expressed on more than one occasion a preference for being placed in an above-ground mausoleum rather than buried underground, a wish she believed was tied to his enduring grief over the loss of his mother years earlier. Vernon reportedly explored the idea of constructing a permanent mausoleum within the meditation garden, going so far as to consult with architects about potential designs. But the Presley estate, despite the fortune Elvis had earned during his career, was facing serious financial strain in the aftermath of his death, and the cost of such a project proved too great. The plan was quietly abandoned, and Elvis remained buried in the ground his father had chosen instead. A small, largely unspoken example of just how much even a global icon's final wishes could be shaped by financial reality rather than personal preference. In the decades since, the meditation garden has grown into something far larger than a single grave. Vernon Presley himself was eventually laid to rest there. Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae Presley, joined the family plot as well. A small memorial marker honors Jesse Garon Presley, Elvis's twin brother, who died at birth and whose memory Elvis reportedly carried with him throughout his life. More recently, tragedy touched the family again with the death of Elvis's grandson, Benjamin Keogh, followed by the death of his only daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, both of whom now rest in the same quiet corner of the estate. What began as an emergency decision made in the panic days after a break-in plot has, over nearly 5 decades, become the resting place of an entire family story. Generations of joy, fame, tragedy, and loss folded into a single small garden that millions of visitors now walk through every year with a kind of hushed reverence usually reserved for far older monuments. Nearly 50 years after Elvis Presley's death, the questions that surrounded it from the very beginning have never fully disappeared. The sealed autopsy records remain a matter of public curiosity, decades away from any scheduled release. The exact role that his prescribed medications played in his final hours continues to be debated by medical experts, biographers, and fans who have spent years combing through every scrap of available evidence. And somewhere in the middle of all of it sits one short, unresolved statement from a man who spent a single night closer to the physical reality of Elvis Presley's death than almost anyone else alive. A man who chose to say almost nothing for 33 years, and who, even when he finally did speak, left the actual truth of what he saw permanently out of reach. Maybe that's the reason this particular mystery has held on so much longer than most. It isn't built on wild, unfounded speculation. It's built on the words of someone who was actually there, someone with nothing obvious to gain by making up a story, who nonetheless chose his words so carefully that they revealed almost nothing at all, and everything at once. Elvis Presley's music has never stopped playing. Millions of people still visit Graceland every year, still stand quietly in that small garden, still feel the pull of a story that seems, even after half a century, to be missing its final chapter. Perhaps it always will be. And perhaps that unfinished quality is part of why the legend has never faded. Because as long as questions remain, so does the fascination, the devotion, and the enduring presence of the man so many still simply call the king. What do you think really happened behind those doors that night? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the next video for more.